Let's talk a little bit about the spiritual vacuum created by the decline of Christianity, which you have a very long and powerful piece in the book about. And of course, Christianity, with its concept of original sin and the need to redeem yourself for the sins, I guess intergenerational, all the way back to Adam and Eve, sins of history. It's almost like, to paraphrase what you're saying in the book, and correct me, of course, if I go astray, but it's almost like when original sin was taken out of the consciousness, the need for guilt and self-flagellation and self-punishment seems to have been replaced by a revisionist historical narrative that have painted Europeans as the basic devils of the world.
Yeah, there is something in it. This is a sort of truth I'm trying to get to. Yes, it's just because you lose your religion doesn't mean you lose the impulses of religion or indeed the memories of it. And I do think there's a sort of secularized version of Christianity which exists for the better in all sorts of ways, and with some very unpleasant connotations along the way. The concept of original sin, as it's now been translated into European politics, is particularly filled with iniquity for one reason in particular, which is this. The religious notion of sin in the Christian understanding can, of course, come to redemption. And the non-religious, post-Christian idea of sin has no redemption apart from self-destruction. So the idea that we in Europe, and indeed, I say in the book, this is the same thing that America, Canada, Australia, and indeed Israel, I would argue, all the countries that are sort of seen to be, rightly or wrongly, sort of cousins or offspring of the European culture. All of these countries also are alleged to suffer from an original sin, which we put on no other societies. I mean, you never hear someone saying that there is an original sin in Turkey, and that as a result, the world must move into Turkey and abolish basically Turkish culture. It's only the Western countries that have it. And as I say, if you have a sin like this, I think this is very much the debate that America is going through still, to do with race and reparations and all this sort of stuff. There's this endless question of how you could absolve yourself of the sin of racism, colonialism, and so on. And again, I mean, what educated, sensible person wouldn't recognize the wrongs that their ancestors had done? But to end up in this situation where it's as if they are always before you, these sins, at the same time that the rest of the world, I mean, you never hear anyone saying, we must go and find reparations for the people who Genghis Khan and his crew, moved out of their homes. But yet we, weirdly in the West, are these people whose guilt is ever before us. And the only answers you ever come to are basically, therefore we must destroy ourselves. These are sins without redemption. And as I say, the only redemption being the fire of self-destruction. It's why we have the culture of self-abnegation, as the conservative philosopher Roger Scruton once termed it. That means that we have to war on ourselves.
It is an extraordinary perspective when you zoom out in that kind of way. And it is something that does seem to be endemic to the West. I mean, certainly there are religious reasons, there are cultural reasons, there are, I think, some leftist guilt-provoking reasons. But I also think that there are economic reasons. So insofar as, I mean, if there is any group, I would argue, any group that should be least criticized for the institution of slavery, it would be white Western European Christians for two basic reasons. Number one, they indulged in the practice of slavery for only a few hundred years, basically, and ended the institution in their own countries as soon as humanly possible. And so I mean, if you compare it to the Muslim slave trade, which is reported to have killed over 100 million Africans in the most brutal fashions, including the removal of the testicles and so on, that is the brutal situation. So the white Western European Christians engaged in slavery for the least amount of time and expended untold blood and treasure to end the practice worldwide. And I think what that that does is you stand up and you say, wow, we really hate and fear and feel terrible about slavery, so we're going to work really hard to end it. And I think what that does to other cultures around the world is say, those guys feel really, really bad about this. Let's install the racism button. Let's install a colonialism button. Let's keep pounding it and pounding it and pounding it, because every time we do, they cough up free resources for us. It's like we've become this vending machine, and then we wonder why we keep getting pounded with these insults. It's because we pay to make them go away, and therefore we're only, supply creates its own demand.
Yes, I mean, that's why I say, I repeatedly use the description of us in my book as being masochists. I mean, we are actually paying people to beat us up. It's an extraordinary thing, and sometimes in the most visible ways. The number of terrorists we now have across the continent of Europe who, after they detonate, or after they persuade other people to detonate in our cities, turn out to have been receiving welfare payments right up until the moment. There was a guy in Britain, I'm sure you've heard of him over there, called Anjem Choudhury, who now mercifully is in prison. He was a long-time adversary of mine. We crossed swords on many occasions. Anjem Choudhury was a really vile hate preacher who recruited people to terrorist causes. He used to take £25,000 a year in welfare payments in Britain. And when one of our soldiers, drummer Lee Rigby, was decapitated on the streets of London in 2013 by two people who were close to the Choudhury network, Choudhury and co were all over the airwaves making excuses for these killers and refusing to condemn them. But very few people pointed out, I tried to at the time, that the starkest thing about this was that Anjem Choudhury was better paid by the British state than drummer Lee Rigby was. That is insane. We may not be the first society in human history to be paying both sides in a conflict, but we're probably the first societies in human history to pay our enemies better than we pay our own troops.
And this is what I mean by this sort of conscription. You conscript the bodies of people in war, and you're now conscripting the money of people in the pursuit of this utopian fantasy, and it is really appalling. The British people not only are not consulted on any regular basis, and I would argue, as you point out in the book, I think, Douglas, that the politicians in the UK and across Europe regularly stand tall, spine stiffened, and snarl particular invective into the wind about controlling immigration, and that's enough, and we need to have borders, and then betray regularly the public who vote them in, I think, on the grounds of wanting some limits to all of this kind of stuff. Not only are they not asked as to whether they fundamentally want to be replaced, because as the birth rate of immigrants grows up, the birth rate of the domestic population goes down, which means it's not an addition to society. England is not England plus immigration. England is English minus English people plus immigrants over the long run. And nobody's asked. And of course, they're forced to pay for this through the redistributionist welfare state.